Truth. That's all I got to say. No, a big question I have in this section is I don't, and this probably means I'm missing something big here, but I'm wondering what the relation between truth and see, to use the old translations edition or vocabulary, the relation between truth and beings present at hand versus ready to hand. And I don't, maybe truth doesn't have anything to do with those, but he talks, if truth is this sort of disclosedness of things. And so, and here's part of my confusion is when he's talking about statements and the relation of statements to truth, I'm tempted to say that because of the way he traces the development of the traditional notion of truth as this sort of adequatio, this sort of this equation, that he talks about statements as turning into things present at hand, and then they're related to other things present at hand. And he says, at least in this edition specifically, then that means that these statements are now operating in this world of what he in this translation calls objective things with objective presence, which would be the present at hand. And so I guess what I'm confused about is truth. Does truth just relate Dasein to things present at hand? I'm sorry, ready to hand, and therefore is fundamentally inarticulable? Or is there a mode of truth that is, what's the word? Accurately is not the right word, but is there some sort of mode of truth that actually does operate in the domain of at least authentic truth, the way he describes it, in the domain of objects present at hand? Or is that always just this derivative mode of truth that is not really, primordial truth? I guess the basic idea is like this notion of primordial truth and, Dasein is in truth. Is that only referring to these Dasein's relation with interworldly beings ready to hand? Again, I don't even know if that question makes sense, because, and if it doesn't, that just means I don't understand what the hell he's talking about. But I'm trying to figure out what the relation between this idea of the truth, this sort of primordial notion of truth, and this ontological difference between ready to hand and present at hand things. But again, I'm not even sure the question makes sense.
One thing to add that might create more confusion is that he says at one point that when things become uncovered and they get transformed into statements, the statements can be picked up as ready-to-hand things. So it sounds as if he has like kind of two ways in which a statement can go. It can either be used as this ready-to-hand thing, or it can be thought of as this present-at-hand relationship between the statement and then the present-at-hand object in the world, and that's where we get this idea of like a correspondence theory of truth.
But what confuses me about that, so that's the same impression I got, but what confuses me about that, as soon as you make a statement, I'm having a hard time for figuring out how a statement would pick out something that is ready to hand. Because it seems as soon as you make a statement, it seems like you're already, I don't know, maybe I don't understand the way he thinks language works, but to make a statement about something seems to be treating it as an object that is present at hand. So I got the same impression. I mean, that was again one of my questions. Again, is similarly is there are there these two different modes in which statements can operate? One where it is in this sort of domain of things ready to hand, and then also in present hand. Because if so, I don't see what kind of statement could actually, pick something out ready to hand. Because I thought picking out was already looking at things as present at hand.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure either. My own idea was that like and I think probably others here might disagree with me, but in general, my own kind of conception of what he means by ready at hand versus present at hand is like what probably most non-philosophers, like when I think of my parents thinking about things, like I feel like most of the time they're living in, and me too, like this is just the natural way of being, is being in the ready at hand mode. And my mom's not like thinking about like the underlying properties that hold up a cooking pan or something that she's like working with or whatever. Even maybe because she doesn't practice philosophy, like to do so might be a bit unusual for her. And I think in the same way, like typically the way we're working with language is I guess I was thinking in the same way, like when you're having a conversation with someone, it's not as if the statements that you're making are usually like investigatory or something, and like stance taking. That's at least how I was thinking of it. It's mostly a stance thing,
So
but
if you made a comment like this knife is dull, is that a statement about something ready to hand or present at hand?
I feel like it could be ready to hand, right? Like if you're in a kitchen and the context is you're trying to communicate to someone that like the knife needs to be sharpened. I don't think you're trying to pick out something about the knife that's like that you want them to understand for the sake of understanding a property about the knife. Like the goal there is to say this is a situation that we have to fix. I mean, that's a good example because I feel like that's those kinds of examples Heidegger wants to use for when the ready at hand can shift into the present hand. So I don't know. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
that example could go either way.
Well, yeah, actually, just to piggyback on this really brief, really, I thought that the knife being dull would be like an example of like when it's sharp, it's ready to hand or ready at hand, and it's doing what you want it to do, and you don't have to think about it at all. It's just sort of like a part of your body. But then when it's dull, it suddenly has like that dullness kind of pulls it out of the ready at hand into the present at hand. And I thought like maybe I don't know where I think that there's like a slight difference between our I think maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, I think
Well, that's
I
the way
think
I was thinking about it, because like the broken
right,
hammer, that's the example he uses, right? So
right.
when you're using the hammer, it's ready to hand, or sorry, yeah, ready to hand. Like you said, because you're not thinking about it. It is part of your, the equipment in the environment that you use to do things. But when the thing breaks, it's like, oh, that's a hammer, and then it becomes present at hand, right? So, yes, that's the way, because that way of thinking makes me wonder, because I'm still not sure, James. I'm undecided, but that kind of thinking that Hunter was expressing makes me wonder whether things that are ready to hand are even articulable in language. That's kind of the question, though.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the motivation for why I was thinking um it has to be because he does seem to suggest that like statements can be used in a ready at hand way. It seems like you're then committed to saying that um things when you're treating an entity in a ready at hand way, it doesn't have to be this like non-cognitive thing. Like you can have this cognizing activity going on or something. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I also feel like there are a lot of examples in the book that seem to directly contradict that view.
I'm curious what, I mean, maybe this is wrong, but I would wonder if he would maybe think that like if you were engaging in like a scientific context, not that he thinks, I know he's like critical of the extent to which, of scientism and all this, but like obviously science is doing something. People are in a community trying to like seek out whatever, let's say like, the pandemic, uh, um, you know, uh, what do shot or whatever. Um, I mean, it seems that one would be needing to make statements that are like simultaneously whatever, like present at hand and ready to hand. Like you're trying to make abstractions, but you're also trying to apply it to the world, and you have a goal that's like that is prefigured by the context you're in and all of that. Like seems there are certain domains where a statement can simultaneously be like, a kind of a statement of like a true false statement in a kind of classical syllogistic way or whatever, and completely applicable to the world as it's unfolding in an arena of coherence and all of this stuff that he's trying to call to our attention.
Yeah, this I think it's a good question. So I think he does want there is some kind of so discourse is one of these existentials. It's one of these an existential structure of Dasein. It's a big deal. And then that discourse is where Dasein expresses itself as a being towards entities or beings within the world. So I think that statement or assertion does work with this. It definitely starts with some kind of ready to hand the entities within the world. And that itself involves a interpretation from the understanding, an articulation of the phenomena. So there's definitely still some kind of articulation of entities within the world that belongs to the ready to hand of entities within the world, and Dasein's being towards those things.
But I thought discourse is I don't know if it would be right to call it an existential, but discourse is one of these sort of, like he puts in quotes, a priori sort of I want to call them transcendental structures that make language possible. So, I mean, I thought of discourse as something like the fundamental communicability of things, not actually the act of communicating. So again, one of these things that, this sort of pseudo-Kantian language, like discourse is what makes language possible, something like that, which is not the same thing as language. So that Dasein could be, I don't know what the right terminology, Dasein could, or a fundamental existential feature of Dasein could be discourse, but that wouldn't necessarily also say that every statement is an expression of or that there are statements that wouldn't necessarily imply that there are statements that are expressions of the primordial being of things. I'm sorry if that again didn't make any sense.
Yeah, I guess that gets into the whole, what is the relation between the conditions and the conditioned, which I still think I'm still not entirely sure exactly how it works for Heidegger. But either way, I think so the statement is definitely involved with, so it has to do, discourse has to do with an expression of Dasein, which has to do with these statements, which has to do with articulations of interpretation that has to do with understanding and projection and all that. I'm not sure where along that line, that very complex line of conditioning and conditioned, where it goes awry, or where it just becomes, merely ontic, maybe he would say. But it has to do with the way that he talks about how, so this from 157 in the German pages, and 158, this is where he talks about, but how does the statement become a derivative mode of interpretation? What has been modified in it? So I think this is the problem that we're really asking about. This is how the statement goes from something that has to do with interpretation, this articulation within the ready to hand, to the articulation of something that's present at hand, which then he says, well, the relation itself then becomes something that is present at hand, as the assertion statement also becomes that. That's when you get truth as correspondence. So he wants to show that truth as correspondence is something derivative of the more primordial idea of truth as uncoveredness. And he does that in the same way. It has to do with the way that statements or assertions themselves move from this ready to hand articulation of interpretation to the derivative mode of it, which I think. So he says that the assertion, it's an assertion about something. So, but it can be an assertion either about something that's ready to hand or something that is present at hand. And I think that might be the key of trying to understand exactly how that transition occurs to this derivative mode. So if it's about something present at hand, I think that's where then the assertion itself becomes, by relating things that are present at hand, itself becomes something that is present at hand. And the relation itself becomes something present at hand as agreement or correspondence, because it gets this overly formal structure of kind of like formal logical identity. Then you get, the way that Aristotle talks about it, the Greek word, I think, is something like, what is it? Homo something, where homo is same. It implies some kind of equality, sameness. And that's where you eventually, Aquinas and all of them, they get adequation from. So I think the way that you get this kind of like abstract sameness, equality, adequation, that's something that can only occur with the present at hand, where it's decontextualized in some way, brought forward as this kind of like this object without a context, where the ready to hand is all about its articulation within the context of relations. Because I think that's when he was talking about the statement assertion as something that works with uncoveredness, that primordial aspect of truth, that it's the relation that holds or preserves this uncoveredness along with it. So I think the present at hand is something that removes it from that contextual relation in which it's involved within the world. So, the hammer, with the fact that it has the quality of these, qualities that maybe we could pick out in present at hand, but in their relations as ready to hand, they're involved with the whole context of the workshop, my projects, why I want to build a house, all these things. So I think that's the major difference. And although the other thing that I think is relevant is he does talk about there's aspects there seems to be aspects in which the fallenness, especially into the aspect of hearsay, that's involved also with this transition from ready to hand that preserves uncoveredness within the relation as a statement or assertion. So you could still have some kind of assertion statement about that preserves this aspect of it. But then once it becomes something that's becomes hearsay, that's circulation within the public interpretation of Das Man, that can only be something that corresponds with the present at hand. So I think that's also involved. And possibly one way to at least make it a little more concrete. So if you think of this fallenness, you think of social media, you know. So in order think about somebody explaining their experience of some kind of event versus the way that it's written up in a news report and then circulated as hearsay. It could be something like that. I'm not totally sure. That's maybe an oversimplification of it. But I think that's at least one way to see how maybe there could be this kind of transition from ready to hand wrapped up in all these relations versus present at hand.
So I want to read, so that paragraph that Chase was referring to at the bottom of H158, I'm sorry, the bottom of H157, he actually gives an example. So Chase was reading from the beginning of that paragraph, but if you keep reading, he gives an example. So again, this is at the very bottom, the last paragraph on Heidegger 157. Let's see. That which logic makes thematic with the categorical statement, for example, the hammer is heavy, it is always already understood logically before any analysis. As the meaning of this sentence, it has already presupposed without noticing the following. This thing, the hammer, has the property of heaviness. Initially, there are no such statements in heedful circumspection, which I think is that mode. The heedful circumspection is when you're embedded in this context of ready to hand stuff, right? But it does have its specific ways of interpretation, which can read as follows, as compared with the theoretical judgment just mentioned, and may take such form as the hammer is too heavy, or even better, too heavy, the other hammer. The primordial act of interpretation does not lie in a theoretical sentence, but in circumspectly and heedfully putting away or changing the inappropriate tool without wasting words. So I mean, I'm taking it. I think, am I right in thinking that those two, not even exactly, at least the second one's not even really a statement, but the hammer is too heavy, or even better, too heavy, the other hammer, is that, it sounds like he's saying that is a use of language that is not present at hand. Is that correct? That, like, when you say the hammer too heavy, that's like using language yet within that context of heedful circumspection.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. Yeah.
So that would be an example. Again, it's hard for me to think of others given that, but that sounds like a use of language that actually manages not to be jettisoned from that embeddedness.
Yeah, I think so. For that particular example of too heavy, other hammer, you can see how, because it's so involved with the action of what's going on, I think you can definitely see how that is very much immersed in Dasein's projects within the world, all that.
Yeah, so maybe, James' mother says, dull knife, give me the other one. Maybe that's a use of
that's
language.
right at hand. Yeah.
Well, okay, I have a question about basically well, I mean it's sort of about those statements. There's definitely some sort of okay, I want to verify a couple things basically. I just want to clarify some stuff. The first thing I want to clarify is the equipmental context. I just want somebody who knows about this better than me to tell me if I'm right or not or wrong when I say this. When I think about the ready at hand and the use of statements that are ready at hand and that could qualify as being a part of the world of the ready at hand, the ready to hand, I think of that as my rule of thumb is it a part of an equipmental context? And the phrase equipmental context, I just imagine the workshop. You know what I mean? And the things that can fit there, like you were saying, too heavy. Give me the thing. Just that using a phrase within that equipmental context, I think would satisfy whatever condition I could think of for a ready at hand statement. Now, ready to hand. Now the statements that we can make about some thing, if we're going to say that we're making statements about something, rather than saying like we're just participating in some sort of being uncovered all the time in all of our statements, whatever. When we're saying something about something, there's this. Okay, specifically for the Macri and Robinson, which is my edition, like I've said, it's page 261. I run into this question that I want to know about these statements and knowledge, the relationship to knowledge, and
Is that
things.
Heidegger 261?
Well, actually, it's Heidegger 218. It should be the bottom of Heidegger 218. Bottom of Heidegger 218, which would be at the top and middle of Macri Robinson 261. So there's this paragraph that starts on Heidegger 218. It starts with, let us suppose that someone with his back turned to the wall makes the true assertion that the picture on the wall is hanging askew, right? At least in Macri Robinson translation. So I have a basic summary of this paragraph. And it's that knowledge is a sort of confirmation of being uncovering. And he kind of makes that explicit over the course of this paragraph. Knowledge is a sort of confirmation of being uncovering, or the being uncovered. Being true as being uncovering, right? That's kind of what he's laying down. But he makes this claim, and it's in the italics in Macri Robinson. I don't know if the italics are always the same, but in Macri Robinson, there's a sentence that's italicized almost at the bottom of 218 that I wanted to ask about. I'll actually start the sentence before. This undiscoveredness is confirmed when that which is put forward in the assertion, namely the entity itself, shows itself as that very same thing. Confirmation signifies the entity's showing itself in its self-sameness. Okay. That is a weird question. That is a weird statement. I have two big questions about that. Two big ones. First off, can my statements, ready to hand or otherwise, participate in that self-sameness? Can they capture that self-sameness? Can they apprehend or express that self-sameness? Right on the fucking money, The second question is, does Heidegger believe in like a conatus? Like a thing has like a self-same sort of conatus? Like things just kind of exist in their self-sameness kind of sort of stuff? Because there are certain people who would say, oh, that's hokum. And I would say, I don't know what his stance is on things preserving themselves in their self-sameness yet, fully. Those are my two things. Thanks.
I'm sorry, would you repeat the first one again?
Yeah. Can we use statements and like language to like when a thing uncovers itself in its self-sameness, we've got the truth. That's awesome. Can we capture that uncovering in a linguistic expression? That can I, in some way, I don't know how. The second thing is, does Heidegger subscribe to something of like a conatus in objects? Like, do things preserve their self-sameness? That's it.
Are you asking if we can like make true statements about the process of something being uncovering as opposed to like a statement that is about that's like representing something that is uncovered? Is that what you're
I'm
saying?
at, I guess I'm at, yeah, I guess I'm wondering if I'm wondering if there's any part of like is this paragraph that where the philosopher Heidegger is writing out these sentences about the process, is that nailing it? Is that hitting the uncoveredness? Is the uncoveredness, being uncovered through this language? And then further, once it's uncovered, can we respect, like, I don't know, transmit, communicate that uncoveredness to another with language?
So the way that I'll just say, at least this is the best answer I can give, is I think what so in the assertion about the picture on the wall is hanging askew, kind of a weird example, but at least it's an example. Um, so I think that would be that's an act of uncovering. So it's not so much that there's an assertion and that's separate from this act of uncovering necessarily, but I think it's kind of involved in it. So if I were to tell you, I don't know, give you some information about, let's take the stereotypically very boring example, like the sky is blue. By me making this statement, I think that's being involved in some kind of uncoveredness itself. Necessarily, it's not, by me making that statement, I'm not kind of like grasping some kind of hidden structure of things in themselves necessarily and bringing that out, or not as a separate thing from the assertion. I don't know. I know it's obscure, but that's the best way I can think about it, is that the assertion is itself kind of this act of uncovering more so than what I just described. As far as the conatus, that's difficult. I think Heidegger is too much of a Nazi to give Spinoza any credit for anything. But I don't think he has that in mind with this necessarily. I think so. What he was talking about with this sentence, confirmation signifies the entity's showing itself in its self-sameness. I think that has to do with the confirmation is when the person who makes the statement turns around and then looks at the painting and confirms that it's askew. So I think the self-sameness would be between the assertion and then this confirmation, and the self-sameness has to do with the entity showing itself. So either it shows itself in the fact that my assertion is about that entity, the painting, and then the confirmation also is a showing itself of the painting, and that's what is self-same.
So it's a self-sameness of the uncovering, not a self-sameness of an object present.
Yeah.
I see. So the conatus is like the self-sameness of like ontic entities or whatever, like, objects in space, however we want to classify that. But this is just talking about the experience of the self-sameness of an uncovering, which, as you described, which I got, like I can kind of get the the statement being a part of that uncovering, this a part of the same uncovering that's happening when you're looking at it, in a sense.
But is
Right.
saying the painting is askew really an uncovering? I mean, it's not saying anything about what the painting's about. It's just talking about its relation in terms of expectation of how we think paintings are usually hung. right? We have a rectangular sense of paintings where they're going to more or less line up with the vertical sense of the wall that they're on. But that's not saying anything about the actual content of the painting. That just seems very surface and at the same time, in some ways, relational, but not anything of the painting itself.
I don't think in this example he's actually trying to address the content of the painting at all. I don't like when he says what I don't think that's I mean, I think that's another thing he could explore, but I don't think that's what he's addressing here. I think what he's addressing here is the painting as something that is in the just as a being in the world. You know, like there's a painting and then there's a wall hanging and then there's a chair. I don't think he's addressing what it's about in the sense of what the content is trying to portray in this example.
Yeah.
Well, no, but I was trying to get I was trying to get. I agree with you, Nevin, but I was trying to get at what is he saying about the statement the painting is askew in terms of the vocabulary that he's created about thing in itself or the I apologize, I'm forgetting the terminology y'all have been using tonight. Self same, or is it the distinction you all were making earlier between saying the knife is dull can actually be interpreted right in a different way. So how is I mean, I understand that with the knife example, right? But not unless it's the similar in that if someone says the painting is askew, they're assuming someone's going to make it not askew, right? That it's a criticism that says you need to change this. In the same way that if you say to someone, well, the knife is dull, that's implying somebody needs to sharpen this knife. That's the only way I can see those two statements being equivalent.
So the way I'm thinking of this is Dasein is that being, you know, so Dasein is being in the world. And the world is this vast interrelated, these objects that are interrelated with one another in this kind of this, you know, that there are these contexts of meaning in which these objects are related. And Dasein is the being that makes those things, in a sense, appear, emerge as these things in a world. And so Dasein, being in the world, is the being that brings, in a sense, brings things into being by its presence. So so the way I'm reading this is, you know, Dasein is already there. There are already all these beings. So statement doesn't do anything, doesn't make anything come to be. What a statement does, it calls attention to something that is there in this vast array of interconnected beings. And so what all the statement does, well, this is on the very top of Heidegger 224, which is the bottom of Stambaugh 214. So Dasein expresses itself as the being toward beings that discovers. And in statements, it expresses itself as such about beings that have been discovered. Statements communicate beings in the how of their discoveredness. Dasein, perceiving the communication, brings itself to a discovering being toward the beings discussed. The statements are made about something, and in what they are about, they contain the discoveredness of beings. The discoveredness is preserved in what is expressed. What is expressed becomes, so to speak, an inner-worldly thing at hand. And so the way I'm thinking about this is what the statement does initially. The statement, the content of this, so the content of the statement, at least with regard to its initial function, is merely to focus the attention on a being that is already there. So like the painting and its askewedness is already there, and it's already there as a being for Dasein, because Dasein is the being for which there are beings in the world. What the statement does is the statement merely points that out. It sort of brings it forward to one's attention. And I think, you know, if I want to, I'm not, again, not, this is not the right language, but the sort of proper, not proper, the sort of primordial use of language, again, not probably the right way to say this, is to do that. It has this function, statements have this function of sort of bringing things forth into our attention that are already there, of drawing attention to something. And so the statement the function of that statement is just to point out this object that is already in your sphere of interconnected beings around you. Look at it. Here it is. There it is. This painting in its you know, skewedness. But then what happens is that because that statement, and this is like in the last thing, what is expressed becomes, so to speak, an interworldly thing. That happens when it's expressed. This discoveredness is preserved in what is expressed. So then when you speak that statement, that becomes an object present at hand. It becomes a present at hand being, because it is now a statement out there in the world like other objective things. And so now it becomes, as he says, what is expressed becomes, so to speak, an inner worldly thing at hand that can be taken up and spoken about further. And so it seems like there's these two different, there's the function of the statement, which doesn't necessarily have to break that context of interrelatedness. It simply sort of makes it stand out. It sort of brings it forward to our attention. But if there is a problem, when you speak that statement, and that statement now becomes an object present at hand, now you have this statement thing that can get related to other objective things. And that statement has sort of broken out of that context of usability. So I don't know, that probably doesn't answer your question, but that's just the general way it seems to me he's thinking of statements. Their primary function is just to call attention to sort of raise into our awareness beings that are already there. It's, you know, it's just like saying, look there, that thing is. But then when you turn it into a statement and literally speak it, it then sort of boom, it snaps it. That statement now becomes a thing in the world that is present at hand. No, yes. Still get those two mixed up.
Well, it seems like there's also, I don't remember where it is, but later on in the text, towards the end, he's going into how, like, he's trying to get rid of the notion of like eternality, I guess, and that it seems like he's saying that the things which we say as statements, or the objects that we are kind of engaged with, are always in relation to Dasein, such that to even utter something, you know, a statement, or, you know, is to be in like a kind of deep relationship with being itself, you know, such that there's no Daseinless world, I guess, or Daseinless discrete objects or anything like that. Maybe this is a non sequitur, but I'm just curious if people want to jump on that thread or go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I didn't really think about this until you just mentioned, but you know, with correspondence theory, obviously all you need are statements and objects to exist. And, you know, we can certainly imagine a scenario in which the human civilization gets wiped out and there's still data lying around from our civilization, like writings and texts and whatnot. And for a correspondence theorist, they would say like, oh, okay, well, whatever statements you find, like those things are true, so long as they, correspond in the right way to something in the real world. Whereas, Heidegger wants to say, no, actually, it has to be that there's like kind of three things in relation. There's Dasein, there's the assertion, and then there's the thing. And the assertion has to uncover the thing for Dasein in order for truth to happen.
So this is where I'm going to point out, like, again, what I found particularly surprising about this reading is Heidegger seems to locate truth in the first instance, or most primordially in the disclosedness of Dasein, not in the disclosedness of things.
But it's a disclosedness of entities within the world. So he wants to kind of still have that relational aspect of it, in the sense that it is Dasein it's a uncovering that's a being towards entities within the world. So that's how he kind of gets out of that it's a kind of self-referential subjectivity kind of thing.
I think of this as being the sort of ontological version of Husserl's, well, not, and I'm sure before Husserl, but Husserl's intentionality thesis. That there is that consciousness is always conscious of something, and so there's always a sort of correlate. That you're never. I mean, this is not true actually, but that every mode of consciousness is always going to have something of which it is conscious, and I think of this being the ontological version of that. There's Dasein is always going to be in a world, and so there's always going to be beings for Dasein, and so to ask what beings are disclosed, but to ask whether beings are disclosing themselves or whether Dasein is somehow disclosing them, I'm not sure it's that question makes complete sense, because those beings are for Dasein. Like, again, like the intentionality thesis is this object is for this consciousness. And I think that in a similar way, these beings are for the being of Dasein. And in a similar way and I think, part of what he's saying here with there is no truth without Dasein. Well, again, it's like the notion of truth doesn't mean anything except for a being that can have experience of beings. And so if you ask, well, what is truth absent Dasein? It's a nonsensical question, because truth only has meaning for that kind of being. And beings are only for that kind of being. And so you can ask, like, well, what would those beings be without Dasein? That's an abuse of the language, because being only has meaning for Dasein. And so, I mean, I think he's aware of this. He's having to sort of abuse the language to express things like, well, what is again, like ask Husserl, what is the world without consciousness? There is only a world for consciousness, because without consciousness there is nothing for there to be a world. You could say, again, misusing the language, well, yes, something exists in some sort of incorrect use of that word without conscious beings, but it's not something that you can speak about or make any sense about. I think he's making essentially the same point, except in this ontological concept. To ask what the world is absent Dasein is just it's a nonsensical question.
Yeah, I take that to be again, a further radicalization of the Kantian project, because Kant's basically saying, when we speak of objects, we should only speak of objects for us, right? An object for a subject like us. And again, similar, but not as thoroughgoing, dismissal of eternal truths on very much, same kind of ground here.
Yeah, so that also reminds me of how in the the last reading from last week, when he goes over idealism and realism, he seems to, he says that there's aspects of realism that he also wants to keep, and there's aspects of idealism that he wants to keep. And it seems like he comes out most on favor in a kind of transcendental idealism, but with the pretty major exception that it's not seen as this kind of subjective consciousness kind of thing. And I think that's also what he's doing with Husserl's intentionality, in that I know there's a bunch of debate about what exactly Heidegger is doing with it, because on one level he's definitely critiquing intentionality in the way that Husserl is formulating it, which is about consciousness and objects and whatnot. And but I think definitely the way that he's talking, at least about assertion here, that is seems pretty explicitly, he's saying, assertion is only about something. I think that's definitely that's intentionality right there. There's no assertion that's just like an assertion without being about something. But I think that kind of relational aspect that we're talking about of Dasein's being, how it's never just a being kind of stuck in its own sort of subjective solipsism in itself. That's the kind of thing that Heidegger really wants to reject. Instead, it is kind of like an intentional consciousness, in the sense that, no, you can't have Dasein unless you have also this intentional structure that it's about the world. Except it doesn't have quite this like reflective aspect to it that, say, you would think of with consciousness, where it is about subject object. Instead, he would say, no, these are ontological, these precede any kind of a reflective knowing. Instead, it's about, you are, as Dasein, already about a world, because you are that world. It's an ontological relation. So I think there is that aspect to it. So another thing that, never, when you were answering Ed's question, you were talking about, the assertions, how they could kind of have this redundancy to them. And that made me think of, this could be also be an answer to the original question about that transition from the ready to hand to present at hand for assertions. So one of the distinguishing qualities that a lot of linguistic theorists usually point out is redundancy. And that you can communicate something about something. So this is different from a kind of signaling or signs. Okay, so one example I know of is, if you think of bees, so they can give signals to other bees that there's a food source, but their signals can't say, I got a signal from another bee about a food source. It can only say there's a food source, signal food source. But that ability to kind of dislodge the object of the assertion and be able to say, I saw something that's like a food source, to take that and then to be able to communicate to somebody else, you can say, this person told me that there was something there. That free indirect discourse, the redundancy to be able to say something about something else, that way that that's a kind of decontextualization to a certain extent. That's what allows it to be passed on and communicated. The fact that I can say what other people have said to me. And it's kind of like a redundancy also. You think of it as like the cogito, I think, therefore I am. Well, I think, I think, I think. So that kind of indefinite redundancy of things, that's what gives you this aboutness that you can dislodge from the statement itself, but then make it a new statement. I think that is something, that's why he points out that hearsay is also involved in it, because I think that is also doing something where, okay, so somebody has some kind of original uncovering where, okay, I see the painting, it's askew, I communicate that, but then someone else can say, oh, there's this painting, and I heard it's askew down the hallway. So eventually you get it dislodged enough into almost like a game of telephone where you'll still get people saying the painting is askew that have no relation to that kind of uncovering aspect of it, or only very tangentially. So I think that is something along the lines of that transition from the ready to hand assertion that is about this uncovering, this openness of Dasein to an entity within the world that goes along with that assertion the painting is askew. So that, which wouldn't be a kind of like a list of properties of the painting, and definitely not an exhaustive one, but it's just simply stating a kind of relation of openness and uncovering of the painting to Dasein, and is more or less implicitly always related to Dasein. Yeah, I don't know. That was probably obscure, but that's what made me think of.
And then when you express that in language, by the nature of language, at least, well, anyway, our language, you're using universal terms. So you're using terms like painting and crooked, which again, I'm guessing is part of what turns it into the statement into an objective thing that enters the world of the they, because that's how you have to have universal terms in order to communicate through the they. So, maybe you're talking about this one particular object in this one particular context, but as soon as you express it verbally, you have to use these sort of universal terms, which now makes it this abstract, or at least abstractable statement that can travel around through the they world.
Yeah, I think I see it as they have to, so in order to be this hearsay or idle talk that is able to be dispersed within the they self, it has to at least be generalizable. They have to abstract it and generalize it. But I think that's a good point, that so you make this statement like hammer too heavy, and then you can go along and then some asshole like Socrates can be like, well, what do you mean by that? What is hammer? What is heavy? Or something like that. And that's, so the statement kind of has its own inherent potential to possibly have elements extracted out, turn into these general abstract concepts, and that's when it becomes present at hand. So that also made me think of, okay, so you got Socrates, who's an asshole, definitely deserved to die, but you got these cool Greeks, they're all like, yeah, piety, we know what that is. Like, what? It's all good. Because they've got their myths, which that's the form in which you get this generalized aspect of, well, everybody knows what piety is. Think of, haven't you've read Homer, or at least heard Homer, or whatever they did. I guess it wasn't, they didn't read Homer back then. I guess maybe they did. I don't know. But the way that your average Athenian citizen would understand piety is in this kind of ready to hand circulation already within but using these kind of generalizable concepts that also can become easily present at hand. And I think what Socrates would do is take that present at hand, take it out of the right at hand context, then present the discrepancy between those. And then people were like, what the fuck are you? I have, it was aporia at that point. Nobody knew how to answer kind of the universal concept of piety, absent of its context and relations within the way that it was dispersed within the they self, that everybody understood what piety meant. Because haven't you listened to, read Homer and all these myths? Didn't your mommy tell you bedtime stories about the piety of Homer or his heroes? Yeah, I don't know. That's what made me think. Maybe that wasn't coherent. I don't know. Win some, you lose some.
I don't know if he's going to address this, or maybe I don't know. You guys can tell me if he already has and I missed it. But so I don't want to. I'm not insisting that we go on a long discussion about this, but if so, there's not like a transcendental Dasein. I don't think. Um, like, well, I don't know. Maybe there is. I don't know.
Well,
I mean, 'cause I'm trying to think.
I don't think so. Yeah, I'll go with a no for that. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess one thing I want to ask is what is the ontological status of these existentials? But or do we just say were there transcendental conditions for the possibility of these kinds of experiences, and we can't say anything more about that? All we can say is that well, they must be in operation because otherwise we wouldn't be having this kind of experience, and we really can't. That's a boundary we beyond which we cannot penetrate. I don't know because I mean anyway, I'm wondering what the ontological status of those are, and then the reason I ask about Dasein because if there's no so like part. Correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but part of the purpose of the transcendental ego is to account for the experience of there's a Kantian way of putting this, but anyway, the experience of me being I, the I, and so transcendental apperception, that there's a unifying there's a unifying principle, that transcendental apperception, and Heidegger talks about mindness, and the facticity of Dasein, and Dasein is always mine. I I've missed. I mean, is that just a brute fact, or does he have way? Does he have? Because Kant says, well, there's this there. You can't even really say it is, but transcendental ego, transcendental apperception. That's what accounts for the unity of my experience. And then Heidegger says mindness. It's always my experience, but is there anything that accounts for that?
I want to point out Kant also, in his description, elevates the mindness of the subsequent acts of judgment as well. So I think that's something Heidegger is actually building on from Kant, is the mindness. However, what I see Heidegger doing, he's distancing himself from Kant, is less about cognition or like theoretical knowledge as such, and more really trying to bring out more again this embedded way of embedded types of knowing or understanding as primary to like a theoretical type of understanding. The way he sets up the synthetic unity of apperception, I mean, it's part of the project of the critique of pure reason anyway. He's most explicitly engaged with like theoretical, speculative, or scientific kinds of describing the world, and then holds out elsewhere, that it's there's practical knowing, there's, you know, but he doesn't, it's not really fleshed out in that first critique. Even in the third critique, it still remains, the act of judgment still largely remains like a theoretical enterprise. So I think a lot of what Heidegger's really trying to distance himself from Kant, I can see why. Like, I think many of his criticisms of Kant largely land.
I mean, is mindness just an artifact of me having a body?
I mean, Merleau-Ponty would want to say that. That's kind of his answer to everything.
Yeah, I mean, going through this made me want to go back and read that book again, but probably understand it better. And
yeah, it's a long
Jason's
book.
like, no, you're not going to understand it any better.
I mean, maybe at least humor yourself, like into going for it. Yeah.
So for Kant, it would be my subjectivity, which persists, and I can, you know, I can build off of the fact that it's my subjectivity which persists over time. But for Heidegger, it's my being, and it's a way of reflecting on being, in that you can come to your own being in a way that you can't come to other people's beings or any other thing's beings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but and maybe I'm asking for something that you know, that's nonsense. But you know, why is it or what's the ontological basis of it being mine? Is it my body at a particular in a particular location? And I don't even mean location spatially, but location within a world. I don't know. I guess maybe I'm jumping ahead. I guess part of what I'm asking is what individuates me and what makes me aware of my individuality. And Chase had said something earlier about, or in a conversation on Discord or somewhere, that comes out later with regard to death or something.
Right. Yeah, but I think you pointed out exactly the issue is with the question of individuation, so I don't think he's really articulated that aspect of mindness. It seemed to be something that he stated really towards the very beginning, after the introduction or whatnot, where he kind of just asserts it. And but I think it does rely on something. We're like, well, what do you get mindness? It seems to imply that there's some kind of ready-made individuation going on, which is indeed the second division that we're going to do next week. Starts with trying to go over this question. So it goes into like this thing about, well, Dasein as a whole is what we need to uncover or make explicit, and that will lead towards this question of, or he'll articulate it eventually as this being towards death is the individuated Dasein, the ownmost relation. So he does, I guess those things would be something of his answer ultimately to, well, what is the mindness? Well, it's this ownmost relation to your own life in terms of the end of temporality for you, which is death. So the way that you relate to your own death is what individuates you, is kind of the short answer. But yeah, I think I didn't so I remember Kant formulating the transcendental unity of apperception in terms of that mindness of representations. I didn't think to connect that with Heidegger's thing, but now I realize they probably are connected. I don't know. Let's see. I was going to say something else about transcendental ego or something, but it's probably beside the point.
Dasein.
Yeah, I think might as well just try to go into it. So I think what would differentiate Heidegger from Kant in these terms. You know, if Heidegger is doing some kind of transcendental a priori philosophy, what is different from Kant's? And especially with the way that he's critiquing, towards the very end of this reading, the consciousness in general, the pure I. I think that's very much, he's going after the whole Kant and Husserl there, which are basically almost the way that all transcendental philosophy was talked about, was always in these terms. I think there's also something of Fichte also in here, just because he's talking about positing these absolute ideal I's.
No.
I know Tristan's not here, but it made me think of Fichte, some of that too. But I think he's going after kind of like that whole tradition. So I think, okay, what is different from that and what Heidegger wants to do is, so Kant in the Critique of Pure Reason, he's trying to explain the conditions of possibility of knowledge in general and objects in general. And I think that is what Heidegger would see that as already something that's derivative. That's kind of like a reflective consciousness where it's a subject of an object. That's fine, but there's already a kind of interpretation involved in that that's derivative of these more primordial ways of being, which is what he wants to talk about. So instead, he's going to say that the real like subject is going to be Dasein, which is always concretely involved in the world. It's being in the world. So that's going to be what kind of replaces, instead of this kind of consciousness or subject in general that has knowledge of an object in general, and object equals X. Instead, it's going to be these more primordial, concrete, existential, ontological relations between Dasein and the world that constitutes its being, and that's what the existentials are too. They're kind of, so Dasein is constituted its being with these existentials, these characteristics of the way it is, of its being, and that's also always these kind of intentional aspects of how it's about a world. So those existentials are always Dasein about its world. How does it interact with its world? So that's what he's thinking of in terms of also this transcendental a priori, is that's what the existentials are. They're the ways of how is it that Dasein has to be the way of its being involved with the world in order for there to be Dasein at all. That's asking the question of the meaning of being. So I think that's my take on it.
And structurally, it sounds to me that's very similar to Kant, except, like I said, this ontological take on it rather than this consciousness and epistemological take. But Eric, correct me if I'm wrong on not the two worlds, but the two aspect interpretation of Kant. These transcendental conditions for the possibility of experience are kind of they're the limit. You can do this. They're a limit. They form a limitation on knowledge. In other words, he thinks he can do a what's that deduction called? The backward deduction.
Transcendental deduction?
Yeah, that's it. It's just, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I've already used that word. You can do a transcendental deduction to figure out what must be a priori in place in order for there to be an experience of this kind, but you can't ask where did those transcendental conditions come from, right? Because that's as far as you can deduce. You can deduce back and say there are these transcendental conditions for the possibility of experience. But if you say what's the ontological status of those transcendental conditions, I think that's an unanswerable question for Kant, because our knowledge can't push past that. And so is Heidegger making a similar claim that like these existentials are sort of these transcendental conditions for the possibility of Dasein being in a world, but you can't, because like I said, I kind of want to ask, well, what's the ontological status of those existentials? And would Heidegger make a similar claim? And like, that's just not anything you can know. You can figure out what the existentials are that must be in place in order for being in the world of this kind to happen, but you can't ask that, that's just the boundary. You can't figure out anything like, where did they come from, or what is the ontological status of the existentials themselves? Is that just an unanswerable question for?
So I have something I can say about that, but I don't know if Eric, you want to answer that first.
Yeah, I mean, not right now. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So at least what it made me think of was, so there was in the lifetime of Kant, this philosopher Solomon Maimon, and he wrote. So he learned German by reading Kant.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. It seems he was like quite a genius, obviously, to be able to do that. But apparently that's how he learned. I can't remember what he was from. Some Eastern European country, like Lithuania or something like that. But he learned German through reading the Critique, and he wrote Kant a letter where it was somewhat of a critique of the Critique, but also very much he kind of loved Kant a lot at the same time. But the thing that he presented as something that was a problem was the nature of the conditions, and that just like a sheer kind of conditioning of possibility didn't explain exactly how are those conditions actually applied to the conditioned, the experience. So how exactly, like, what's going on, where you're reasoning from the conditioned, these facts of knowledge, in order to this conditioning. Yeah. So the schemata is definitely Kant's way of trying to answer how they interact, how they get from one to the other. But he's saying, okay, the conditions, just possibility in itself from the conditioned isn't good enough. You need to be able to explain, the conditions need to be able to explain in themselves internally how they can do that, not through a kind of external relation of intuitions and concepts, but how are the conditions themselves have the genetic sense of how they unfold into the conditioned. So that sounds, I know, very abstract, but so first of all, I think Kant's response is relevant here to your original question, in that at first Kant said, so in his response to Maimon, which was kind of like through a proxy, but he said that Maimon was the most perceptive person, the most perceptive reader of the Critique that he was aware of. But at the same time, he also kind of poo-pooed Maimon's thing by saying, well, so you're saying, well, what are the conditions of the conditions? I don't know. Fuck if I know. Instead, I'm trying to explain the conditions of the fact of knowledge, the fact that we have scientific and mathematical knowledge. And I did that. And well, where do the conditions of the conditions come from? I don't know. Kind of an interesting question, but that's not that's not what I'm answering. So he's kind of saying like, okay, fair enough, but I'm not trying to do that. I'm just trying to answer this kind of limited conditioning of our knowledge in general. But the thing is, he seemed to take Maimon's critique actually to heart, kind of, while also being like, well, I don't know, that's not what I'm doing in this critique, you know. But he read that basically right when he read that right when he was writing the third critique, which it seems to respond somewhat to Maimon's critiques by supplying exactly what Maimon was saying was missing. Okay, so I think one thing that maybe makes it a little more concrete would be, I think Heidegger, so he does talk about genesis, providing a genesis for the existentials being a genesis for what they condition, to put in more Kantian, half Heideggerian, half Kantian language. But I think one case where I think he does seem to do that is when he talks about fallenness and the different characteristics of fallenness, the idle talk, ambiguity, curiosity. I think if you go into each of those, you can see how fallenness itself is constructed, is generated out of those conditions. So in a way, it's explained, fallenness, through these aspects that itself explain how it becomes the conditioned. So versus a kind of abstract way of saying, well, what is something? You know, what is a cat? I can be like, oh, 4 legs, mammal. That doesn't explain, from 4 legs mammal, you don't get a cat. Although, yes, you can abstract those qualities from it, but no. But from idle talk, ambiguity, and curiosity, you can see how fallenness actually is something that can be generated in this kind of condition of fallenness that is Daseins. That is probably not very concrete, but anyways, hopefully it helped.
So I'm never quite sure what counts as an existential and what doesn't. So what it is, like in that list, is fallenness an existential, or are those other 3 things? So fallenness is an existential, but those 3 are not.
So I think by the fact that, so fallenness is an existential, and then fallenness is constituted by those aspects. So I think they're basically characteristics of an existential.
Okay. But then you said that those 3, in some sense, generate fallenness.
Yeah. So in the sense that you can see from the description of it through those characteristics how it actually becomes a thing, rather than a kind of abstract 4 legs, mammal, furry. From that, you don't get, or 3, so this is something this also relates to, okay, it's more of a fun fact than anything, but the way Spinoza talks about a real definition versus a nominal definition. So the real definition explains how it can be constructed. It gives, where a nominal definition is something that could apply to, really, it doesn't explain exactly how it's constructed, in the same way that there's I know this isn't historically accurate, but what's the Diogenes and Plato's definition of a human as a featherless biped, and then he produces the chicken with its feathers plucked out and is like, behold the man. That's okay, it's kind of stupid, but that's a good example of what the problem with a nominal definition, because you get these just general qualities of things, but no matter how long your list of general qualities, you're not going to actually produce the thusness of a person. Instead, if you have a kind of these conditions that are able to explain the construction of it, the generation of it, that's what's really important. And I think that is what Heidegger does to a degree with that description of fallenness by explaining how so it seems to be the idle talk, ambiguity, curiosity. It's explaining how, let's call it, information is circulated in a way that Dasein is in this fallen state. And that to me is why it seems to be something like a kind of genetic conditioning. Versus something where you could say, I don't know. I think of some kind of like abstract mathematical way of thinking of it. I don't know how you would do that with existentials exactly. It's almost like the more concrete the things are that you're talking about, the more you have to explain them in terms of really concrete processes themselves. And those are going to be the genetic conditions. They're usually going to involve process rather than this kind of abstract, reflective self-sameness. But I don't know. Maybe I'm stretching all this too much, but I don't know.
Well, if no one else is going to talk, I'll ask another question then. So if I understand what you're saying, idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity are, maybe it's not a right way to say it, but like constituent aspects of fallenness, but in some sense they sort of constitute or produce fallenness. And then fallenness is an existential, that is a sort of transcendental condition for certain things, that certain certain modes of being of Dasein. Would that be the right way to say it? So then, then I want to ask, well, so I initially wanted to ask, what is the ontological status, for example, of fallenness? But you said, well, actually, they're sort of, in a sense, generated by these three aspects. But then I want to ask, well, then what's the ontological status of idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity? And is that, so, I mean, I think maybe I have a sense of what you're saying there. So you've got Dasein is thrown into the world. And because of that thrownness, I mean, would it be correct to say that ultimately it is that thrownness that manifests or something like that as idle talk, curiosity, and an ambiguity? So I'm trying to figure out, like, what's the origin story for those three then?
Yeah, so I think the way that he ultimately will explain this is, if you think in terms of the three major modalities of time, thrownness is the past. I didn't choose mommy and poppy. I was just thrown into the world. They didn't consult me first, assholes. No, I don't mean that about my actual parents. Well, maybe, I don't know. But that's past thrownness, and then understanding or projection has to do with future, and then fallenness is our present. And all these things are indeed these characteristics that Dasein has to have about the way that it is in order for it to be the way that it is. So it has to have, you don't have a Dasein without this thrownness from its past into also this understanding of itself in terms of its possibilities, understanding, projection. But all that, none of that comes about if you don't also have this immersion in the present, and that's the fallenness. That's the absorption in the Das Man and whatnot. And all those things kind of go together. So they sort of articulate each other in a lot of ways. They're so you can do a sort of analysis the way that Heidegger does, where you do take them separately, but ultimately, as phenomena, he wants to see those as all Dasein's being is this wholeness. So yeah.
Ultimately, this is just what Dasein is.
Mhm.
And then if you asked him, well, why is Dasein that way? Maybe he would say, go ask God. In other words, maybe that's where, as James said, buck's got to stop somewhere. Maybe you could say, like, he's giving a phenomenological and analysis of Dasein and the being of Dasein. That's what I'm doing. And if you like to ask, well, why is Dasein that way? That's probably not an answerable question.
Yeah, I think the book does stop eventually. So I remember for Thrownness, he says something along the lines of, we don't know the whither of Thrownness. So I can know that I'm thrown, and I'm just here, or there. But Thrownness doesn't know where it came from. The same way, okay, I'm thrown into my life, but I don't know exactly where I came from or how I came from. So I think there is, there's that gap at least for Thrownness. But he also says something similar about truth towards the end of the reading that we had, where he's asking like, okay, this thing about, well, what is the grounding of truth? I think to a certain degree is just saying, or this is kind of what he's talking about skepticism, but I didn't quite understand this part. But I think what he's saying is that the skeptics' questions, they already presuppose Dasein and truth and all the stuff that he's talking about, so that they're kind of nonsensical, and that the things that they're questioning, they have to presuppose the things in order to even have the reasoning to question the things. I probably said that wrong way, but oh well. So I think it eventually does. The thing is, so what would be the difference though between? It's not necessarily that the problem would be that the buck stops somewhere. It would just be, well, does the buck stop somewhere that can help explain concretely how it is that you get from truth to, say, the empirical phenomenal variety of truth? Does it help explain it, or is it like a featherless biped explaining humans, which doesn't really explain it at all?
So he thinks he can explain that part.
I think at least I think so. Yeah.
But nobody could explain from where we are thrown, except maybe a theologian. I don't know. I know there have been Christian theologians that have borrowed from Heidegger. I wonder. I mean, I haven't really read them. I've read some Paul Tillich, which seems to be a bit Heideggerian in places, but I wonder if maybe they try to answer that question because they're willing to, posit something outside the system. But I don't know.
But then you'd have to, is God made it really an explanation, or God did it? Or, yeah,
it's kind of a cop out. But let's just say God. Why not? It's good as answer as any. Well, I talked a whole lot, but nobody
I
else.
think I talked even more. So I think I should probably just shut up now and just hear what other people have to say. That sounds nice.
Yeah. Well, it's actually after
No, no,
nine. So.
everything you all were saying and asking actually was very, very helpful to me, even though, I mean, we're still dealing with Heidegger. So,
I mean, I was just asking questions that I don't know the answer to. So that's when nobody else would talk. Well, here's another question.
yeah, no, no, that's how it should be.
I only have one question, and then Chase kind of dunked on that question kind of midway. So I was just kind of like, all right, any other good questions? I'll kind of cede my time. You know what I mean? When I say that, I mean, Chase, you gave a really good answer to my question, at least. So, you know, thank you for that.
Yeah, the answer was Heidegger hates Jews.
No, no, I
Honestly,
don't think he
I think he
did.
did.
I don't think he did. I think he was ambivalent. I mean, what didn't he have a long time fling, which was more than a fling with why am I forgetting the female philosopher's name?
Uh, Hannah
Arendt.
Arendt?
Arendt. Arendt.
Arendt. Okay. I've never heard her name pronounced, so I've just seen it written. Yeah.
So I heard an anecdote just this past week that Hannah Arendt was really digging Benjamin and was trying to tell her boyfriend Martin he ought to read some Benjamin, and he told her, "I don't mess with that Jew stuff." Something along those lines, exactly. Like dismiss Benjamin out of hand because he's a Jew, but to Arendt's face.
Yeah, the black books have, I don't know, there's a few pretty shitty. I mean, I don't think, I mean, that doesn't mean, I mean, I think he and Hannah Arendt had a relationship, but I think he would like see her as like one of the good ones, but there was definitely just some anti-Semitism going on.
Yeah, there's a big gap between Hannah Arendt and Walter Benjamin politically. I was a bit surprised to hear that Hannah Arendt was into Benjamin, but apparently she was impressed with Benjamin and recommended him to Heidegger. I don't think you realized how a fascist your boyfriend really is. You know.
Well, but see, that's I mean, I really want us to talk about the relationship with Heidegger and Nazism, but I thought we promised we were going to do it when we're all done with this text. Secondly, side issue, fascism and Nazism are not the same thing. They have surface similarities, but when you actually look at the core concept of the two of them, they're different. And fascism has much more ideological content than does Nazism. And insofar as Nazism has some ideological content outside of its idiotic anti-Semitism, it's really borrowing from fascism. And fascism does predate, right, both in terms of its ideology and in terms of actually taking power, Nazism by over 10 years. I mean, Mussolini becomes the head of Italy in roughly, I want to say 1922. And the lunatic doesn't take over Germany until late January 30th, 1933. So
I've never really understood what fascism is.
I can send you some articles.
That would be good.
One actually written by Mussolini, and it's scaringly articulate. It's not like the dribble that Mein Kampf is full of.
Every time I try to look for a definition, I just get lots of vague stuff that I don't really understand. So yeah, that would be helpful.
Well, there are some people today who will say there's been too much of an emphasis on fascist ideology. And if you really want to know what fascism is, you have to look at fascism in practice, which means look at Mussolini's regime from its onset until he's overthrown. Well, even after he's overthrown by the Grand Fascist Council, I mean, he did kind of cobble together a new republic, which some people will say had some innovations at the very end of Italian fascism as a governing ideology.
And with regard to asshole philosophers, I don't. When I've mentioned before, my very first semester in grad school, I had a class in Heidegger and Carnap, which just about killed me. And we spent, I don't know, at least half of a class one, and the classes were 3 hours long, and we spent at least half of one of them talking about why are so many philosophers such terrible assholes. So, you can go down a list. There's a lot of them. Okay. ¿Estamos listos?
So
I'm
I
sorry.
have one more thing. Okay, speaking of asshole philosophers, I saw something the other day that is definitely in that area. So I'm just gonna read this real quick. Okay. Okay. So it's on Maynard Keynes. It's a biography of Maynard Keynes, and I'll just read it. So Maynard and Lydia had planned to spend the first month of their married life at Tilton, but the house was already let to tenants who refused to budge. So they rented another house in nearby Iford, just south of blah blah blah, where the usual stream of visitors arrived. A disturbing guest was the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who landed from the New Haven ferry on August 20th for a 6-day stay. He had given up philosophy to teach in a village school in Austria because, as he explained to Keynes, the pain it gave him overcame the pain of doing philosophy as a hot water bottle against the cheek takes away the pain of a toothache. He had also given up his huge inheritance, so Keynes had to send him £10 for the journey. Wittgenstein's conversational method was like a punch in the face. What a beautiful tree, Lydia remarked, no doubt brightly. Wittgenstein glared at her. What do you mean? Lydia burst into tears. Keynes, too, was driven frantic by Wittgenstein's obsessive monologues. And that's it. So Wittgenstein was an asshole.
Yeah.
Like somebody's like, what a beautiful tree on their honeymoon that you've crashed. And you're like, what do you mean? Yeah.
Yeah. I have been accused of being less than charitable. So when I switch into philosopher mode, anyway, maybe there's just something about philosophy. I mean, look at Socrates. He was anyway.
Yeah. Like, what do you mean? I mean, a lot of times that's just like, oh my God, really? But, yeah.
Can we make reference to him dropping the word retarded? That was fun to read. I know he
Totally
didn't.
agree. That was it.
It
Yeah.
was just you don't get to read the word retarded a lot, and
Yeah, the retarded analytic methodology of Kant was, I don't know. Look, I'm from the 21st century. I'm going to smile. I'm going to giggle a little bit. I'm going to be like, well, that's kind of funny. He kind of said, and he's kind of using that word in kind of a different way than I use that, or I don't use that. If I did though, I would probably use it in a way that's slightly different from the way he's using it. Okay, that's what made me laugh. All right, that's it.
I know, but if you go back, I'm old enough to remember in the 1960s, that was the polite term to use.
right.
And this was translated in the 60s too. So, I mean, the authors obviously had that connotation in mind.
Yeah, my mom was a special ed teacher, and yeah, that was the common term.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to bring it up because it was kind of it was my attempt at humor. But I'm gonna good meeting everyone. I'm gonna go to
All
sleep.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye.